I was lying in a hospital bed with 2 broken ribs and a fractured wrist when my brother walked in, set a folder on the bedside table, and slid it toward me with a smile I hadn't seen since we were children. "Sign these," he said. "It's just paperwork for Mom's care." I couldn't hold a pen properly. My right hand was wrapped in a splint, fingers swollen, and my vision was still blurring from the pain medication they'd given me an hour before. So he guided my hand. That's what he called it, guiding, and I believed him because he was my brother, and somewhere in the fog of morphine and grief and the particular exhaustion that comes from surviving something that nearly killed you, I forgot what kind of man he had become. What I didn't know was that our family's attorney, Margaret Holloway, had been in the hallway. She had seen him come in, she had watched him leave, and she had already made a phone call that would change everything. Before I go further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that when they finally betrayed you, the shock wasn't the betrayal itself, but the realization that the signs had always been there? Tell me in the comments. Tell me where you're listening from, because what I'm about to share took me 29 years to understand, and I don't want you to feel alone while you hear it. My name is Claire Dunbar. I grew up in a small town outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, in a house that smelled like pine cleaner and my mother's lavender soap. We were not a wealthy family. My father worked at the distribution center on Route 9 until his back gave out when I was 11, and after that my mother worked double shifts at the hospital laundry 3 days a week while also taking care of my grandmother, who lived with us in the back bedroom and needed help getting in and out of the bath. I was the oldest by 4 years. My brother came along when I was 4, and from the moment he arrived, the temperature in the house changed. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it because it is simply what happened. My brother was charming in the way that some children are, naturally, effortlessly, in a way that makes adults lean toward them, like flowers toward light. He had my father's laugh and my mother's eyes, and every relative who visited our house left with some story about what my brother had said or done that was just so funny. Just so clever. I was quieter. I did my homework. I learned to cook dinner so my mother wouldn't have to when she came home exhausted. I got good grades and nobody threw a party about it. The one person who ever seemed to truly see me was my grandmother. She was my mother's mother, sharp and small and unhurried in the way of people who have learned that most urgency is manufactured. She called me her steady one, not as a compliment exactly, but as a recognition. Like she was naming something true. When I was 9, she sat with me on the back porch after a birthday dinner where my brother had accidentally knocked over my cake and everyone had laughed, including me, because that was easier than crying. And she said quietly, "The ones who carry the weight don't always get the credit, but they always get the truth eventually." I didn't know what she meant. I filed it away and went to bed. As we got older, my brother's charm curdled in the way that charm sometimes does when it never meets real consequence. He dropped out of his first semester at community college. He borrowed money from my parents that was never repaid. He cycled through jobs and girlfriends and explanations that were always someone else's fault. My parents covered for him quietly, moving money around, making excuses to relatives, smoothing the surface. Meanwhile, I finished my nursing degree, moved 40 minutes away to Chattanooga, and built something small and steady and mine. An apartment, a job I was good at, a routine that didn't involve managing anyone else's damage. My grandmother and I talked on the phone every Sunday. She asked real questions, not the surface kind. She wanted to know about my patients, about the things that were hard, about what I was reading. She told me about her garden and her opinions about the neighbors, and occasionally something so precise and devastating about human nature that I had to pull over if I was driving. I didn't know until much later that during those same years, she was also meeting quietly with Margaret Holloway, who had been the family's attorney since before I was born, making arrangements that no one in the family knew about. Then my grandmother had a stroke, not a severe one, but enough to change things. She moved from our parents' house into an assisted living facility in Knoxville, a decent place, clean, with a garden she could sit in on good days. My mother was relieved, though she didn't say it. My brother appeared at the facility with flowers twice in the first month, and then not at all. I drove down every other weekend. I knew her medications. I knew her care schedule. I knew the name of her favorite aide and which physical therapist made her feel rushed. It was on a Sunday in November, driving back from one of those visits, that the other car ran the red light. I don't remember the impact. I remember the sound, which was not like anything I expected, more like the world folding in on itself than any kind of explosion. And then I remember ceiling tiles, and a voice asking me what day it was, and then several hours of nothing. When I came back to something like full consciousness, I was in the hospital I worked at, which had an absurd quality to it I couldn't quite process, and my right wrist was fractured in 2 places. 2 of my ribs were cracked, and I had a mild concussion that made the overhead light feel like it was pressing directly against the inside of my skull. My mother arrived that evening, quiet and practical, the way she always was in a crisis. My father couldn't make the drive on his back anymore. My brother arrived the next morning. He was kind at first. He brought coffee. He sat in the chair by the window and asked how I was feeling in a voice that sounded genuinely concerned. He talked about logistics, about Mom's care schedule, about how things would need to be managed while I recovered. I was tired and medicated and grateful for the company. When he produced the folder, I didn't hesitate. My brother guided my hand across 3 pages of documents and told me it was routine paperwork, a general power of attorney to handle things, while I was unable to manage day-to-day matters. Standard procedure, nothing to worry about. I signed where he pointed. He collected the folder and kissed my forehead and told me to get some rest. He was in the hallway for less than 2 minutes before Margaret Holloway stepped in front of him. I didn't know any of this until 6 weeks later. My recovery was slow, which is a particular kind of humbling when you spend your working life on the other side of the bed. I was home in my apartment, wrist still in a brace, ribs still protesting every time I moved wrong, when my phone rang and a voice I didn't immediately recognize said, "Claire, this is Margaret Holloway. I need you to come to my office. There are some things you need to know." Margaret Holloway was 71 years old and had the particular energy of someone who had watched a great deal of human foolishness without letting it surprise her anymore. Her office was on a quiet street in Knoxville, filled with plants and framed certificates and the kind of organized stillness that only comes from decades of careful attention. She poured me tea without asking and set a folder on the desk between us, different from the one my brother had brought to my hospital room, though I didn't know that yet. She told me what she had seen. She had been at the hospital that morning to visit a colleague, and she had recognized my brother in the hallway outside my room. She had seen the folder under his arm. She had watched him go in, and she had waited. When he came out, she had looked at his face, and she said she had known that expression for 50 years on every client who had ever tried to move faster than the truth. She had not stopped him. Instead, she had gone to the nurse's station and asked a question she already knew the answer to, which was whether I had capacity to sign legal documents under my current medication protocol. The answer was no. Then she had called her office and asked her paralegal to pull everything my grandmother had filed with her over the past 4 years. The documents my brother had guided my hand across were not routine paperwork. They were a power of attorney over my grandmother's affairs. Her accounts, her assets, the decision-making authority over her medical care. He had used my name and my signature to grant himself indirect control over everything, because my grandmother had made me her primary contact, and he knew it, and he had been patient enough to wait until I couldn't read what I was signing. I sat in Margaret's office and felt the room tilt slightly, and not from the concussion this time. She let me sit with it. She didn't rush me. She refilled my tea and waited while I moved through the specific kind of numbness that comes before real understanding arrives. Then she said, "Your grandmother anticipated this. Not this exactly, but something like this." She opened her folder. My grandmother had been updating her estate documents every 6 months for the past 4 years, quietly, without telling anyone in the family. Margaret had been the only person she trusted with any of it. She had documented in letters attached to each revision her concerns about her grandson's financial behavior, the loans he had never repaid, the money she had personally seen him take from my mother's purse on 2 occasions, a conversation she had overheard between him and a friend about what he expected to inherit. She had written these letters in her careful, unhurried handwriting, and she had asked Margaret to keep them sealed unless they became necessary. They had become necessary. The documents my brother had me sign were invalid. I had not had legal capacity, and Margaret had a witness and a time-stamped conversation with the nursing staff to confirm it. But more than that, my grandmother had already legally transferred her primary assets into a trust 18 months prior, a trust that my brother had no access to under any circumstances, regardless of any power of attorney. He had spent months positioning himself for something that had already been made impossible without his knowledge. I asked Margaret why my grandmother hadn't told me. She said she didn't want you to carry it. She said you'd already spent enough of your life managing things that weren't yours to manage. I drove back to my apartment and I sat on my couch for a long time without turning on any lights. I want to tell you something about that moment because I think it matters. It wasn't triumph I felt. It wasn't even anger, though that came later. What I felt first was grief, plain and quiet, for the version of my brother I had loved when we were small, for the family I had wanted us to be, for the years I had spent telling myself that his behavior was circumstance and not character. When someone you grew up with becomes a stranger, the loss is complicated in a way that other losses aren't, because you mourn someone who is still standing in front of you. The anger came when Margaret told me what he had done with my grandmother's accounts in the 2 weeks between my hospital stay and her discovery. He had already transferred $14,000 out of a checking account she still had in her own name, an account Margaret hadn't known about, and that fell outside the trust. He had told the bank he had my power of attorney. He had moved the money before Margaret could flag anything. $14,000 that my grandmother had saved over decades of careful, unhurried living, money she had earned doing alterations out of her back bedroom for 30 years, while also raising a child and tending a household. Gone in 2 wire transfers to an account my brother had opened 6 months earlier. I called my mother that evening. I told her what had happened, all of it, plainly. There was a long silence on her end, and then she said, "I'm sure there's an explanation. He wouldn't do that to Mama." I said, "He did." Another silence. "Then you've always been harder on him than he deserved." I hung up gently, not in anger, just because I had nothing left to say in that direction. Margaret had already filed a report with the state's Adult Protective Services regarding financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. She had also contacted the bank and initiated a fraud claim on my grandmother's behalf, given the invalid power of attorney. The next step, she explained when I came back to her office the following week, was a formal meeting. My grandmother had requested it. She wanted everyone present. She had been asking for it from her room at the care facility, patiently, in that unhurried way she had, since the morning Margaret had called her. The meeting was held on a Tuesday in January, in a conference room at the care facility that smelled faintly of institutional coffee and carpet cleaner. My grandmother sat at the head of the table in her good cardigan, the blue one she saved for occasions she considered serious. Margaret sat to her right, with 2 folders and a calm expression that I was beginning to understand was her natural state. I sat to my grandmother's left. My mother and father arrived together, my father moving slowly with his cane, my mother's face arranged in the careful neutrality she wore when she was preparing to manage something. My brother arrived last, 5 minutes late, in a jacket I had never seen before, smelling of the kind of cologne that announces itself before you enter the room. He looked at me and then at Margaret, and then at the folders, and something moved behind his eyes, quick and controlled. He sat down and said nothing. Margaret opened the first folder. She reviewed what had occurred in factual sequence without editorial commentary. The documents produced in my hospital room, the invalid signature, the wire transfers. My brother's expression didn't change while she spoke. He had prepared something. I could see him organizing it in real time, the explanation he had assembled, the version of events that would make this manageable. He started speaking before she finished. He said I had agreed to help him handle things, that I had understood what I was signing, that the money was a loan that he had fully intended to repay, that Margaret was mischaracterizing a family arrangement that was none of her business. My grandmother looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I'd like you to stop talking now." He stopped. She reached across the table and picked up the second folder herself, which surprised me. Margaret had offered to present it. My grandmother had declined. She opened it and she looked at my brother and she said, "I have been watching you for a long time. I have hoped, more times than I can count, that I was wrong about what I was seeing. I was not wrong. She read from the letters. Not all of them. Specific passages she had marked with small paper clips. Her voice was steady. She read about the money he had borrowed and never returned. She read about the conversation she had overheard. She read about the afternoon she had watched him go through my mother's purse while my mother was hanging laundry in the backyard. She read slowly and precisely, the way she had always done everything, and each sentence landed in the room like something being set down permanently. My mother's face had gone very still. My father was looking at the table. My brother had stopped performing. When she finished, she closed the folder and she looked at him and she said, "I did not do any of this to punish you. I did it because I love your sister, and I have watched her spend her entire life being the person this family leaned on while receiving nothing in return, and I was not going to let you take from her the one thing I could give her." She looked at me then. I had to work to keep my face from doing something embarrassing. She said, "I have already updated all documents with Margaret. The trust distributions are final. The fraud claim against the bank is proceeding. There is nothing left to contest." My brother said, "Grandma." His voice cracked on the second syllable. He said, "I made mistakes. You know I've been struggling. You know how hard things have been. We're family. You can't just throw that away." She looked at him with something I can only describe as tired clarity. She said, "I am not throwing anything away, but I am done pretending that love means there are no consequences." My mother covered her mouth with her hand. My brother pushed back from the table and stood up. He said this was insane, that we'd all turned against him, that he hadn't done anything that any person in his situation wouldn't have done, that the money was supposed to be a loan, that he would pay it back. He was talking faster than I had ever heard him talk. He pointed at me and said I had always made him look bad, that I had always been the one Mom and Dad praised, even while pretending not to, that I'd had every advantage and never once offered to share any of it. He said a lot of things. Margaret sat quietly with her hands folded. My grandmother watched him without expression. I let him finish. When he stopped, there was a silence that had real weight to it. I said, "I'm not pursuing the fraud claim personally. That's Margaret's proceeding on Grandma's behalf. I'm not going to the police. I'm not calling relatives. I'm not going to spend my energy dismantling your life." He exhaled. Something in his shoulders loosened. Then I said, "But I am done, not out of anger, because I have finally understood something I should have understood years ago, which is that protecting you was never actually helping you. Every time this family cleaned up after you, we were just making room for the next thing. I'm not doing that anymore." He said, "So you're choosing money over your own brother." I said, "I'm choosing myself." "That's not the same thing." He left the room. My mother followed him into the hallway and I heard their voices. Low and urgent, the familiar sound of her trying to smooth something that couldn't be smoothed anymore. My father looked up from the table. His eyes were wet. He said, "I don't know how we let this happen." His voice was rough around the edges, the voice of someone who had been quiet for too many years and was feeling the cost of it. I said, "I know you didn't mean for it to. I know you both tried." He nodded. He didn't say anything else. Some apologies are too big for words and too important to rush. I left space for that. My grandmother reached over and covered my hand with hers. Her hands were small and dry and certain. She said, "I told you the light would find you," and something I had been carrying for 29 years quietly put itself down. In the weeks that followed, Margaret's proceedings moved forward. The bank recovered $11 of the $14,000 before the account my brother had opened was frozen. The remaining $3,000 was absorbed as a loss and written off in the estate documentation. My brother retained an attorney who sent Margaret a letter that Margaret described as creative and then didn't send another one. The Adult Protective Services case was reviewed and closed with a formal finding that financial exploitation had occurred, creating a record that would follow him. I returned to work on limited duty 6 weeks after that, one hand still tender, ribs still reminding me of their existence every time I moved wrong. My colleagues were careful with me in the way good nurses are careful with each other, attentive without being intrusive. I was grateful for it. My grandmother transferred the mountain property she owned in Gatlinburg to me through the trust. It was a small cabin on a hillside, nothing grand, the kind of place that smells like cedar and wood smoke, and a particular kind of quiet that cities don't have. I drove up on a Saturday in March when the dogwood was just starting to open, and I walked through every room slowly, touching the door frames, running my hand along the windowsills. Her books were on the shelf in the front room, organized in a way that made a particular kind of sense once you knew how she thought. Some of them had her handwriting in the margins. I sat on the porch steps for a long time that afternoon and let the quiet work on me. My mother texted me that evening. She said she was sorry, not for anything specific. Just, "I'm sorry, Claire. I should have done better." I looked at the message for a long time and then I wrote back, "I know. I love you. Let's talk when you're ready." I didn't call her that night, but I didn't delete the thread. My brother and I have not spoken since the meeting. I don't know what his life looks like now, and I've made peace with not knowing. I spent a long time believing that loving someone meant staying in the fire with them. I understand now that it doesn't. Sometimes loving someone means stepping back and letting the consequences arrive, because the consequences are the only honest thing left. A journalist from a small regional publication reached out in April. A colleague of mine had mentioned my story. The accident, the recovery, the legal situation, the cabin. She wanted to write about something she was calling invisible daughters, women who carry their families quietly for decades without recognition. I almost said no. Then I thought about my grandmother sitting down 4 years ago with her careful handwriting and her paper clips and her unhurried sense that the truth would eventually be necessary. She had left something behind for me to find. I could do the same. I said yes. The piece ran in June. Nothing viral, nothing dramatic, but I received 47 messages from women I had never met who said some version of the same thing, which was that they recognized themselves in the story, that they had never heard it said out loud, that they had felt less alone reading it. My grandmother read it from her room at the care facility. Her aide told me later that she had asked her to read it aloud twice and that she had sat very quietly when it was finished and then said, "Yes, that's exactly right." I visit her on alternating Sundays now. She is slower than she was, quieter in some rooms of herself, but the sharpness is still there when it matters. She asks me real questions. I give her real answers. We sit in the garden when the weather is decent and talk about the things that are true. On the drive home, I sometimes think about the version of myself that was lying in that hospital bed, fog-brained and hurting, watching her brother guide her hand across documents she couldn't read clearly. That woman was not stupid. She was not weak. She was someone who had been trained from childhood to trust the people who were supposed to protect her. The betrayal was real. So is the recovery. If you have ever been the steady one, the quiet one, the daughter or the son who kept everything running while someone else took up all the light, I need you to hear this. Being overlooked is not evidence of your worth. It is evidence of other people's blindness. And sometimes, in the quiet, careful way that real love works, someone sees you clearly even when no one else does, and they leave something behind to prove it. That's what my grandmother left me. Not the cabin, though I love it. Not the money, though it matters. She left me proof, documented, notarized, signed in triplicate, that she had seen me. All of it, every year, every Sunday phone call, every drive down and drive back. She had seen me and she had thought it was worth writing down. I keep a letter she wrote in the last update to her trust, the one dated 4 months before my accident. I have it framed on the wall of the cabin, in the room with her books. It says, "To my granddaughter Claire, who learned too early that silence was safer than speaking. I hope you find your voice before you need it, and I hope when the light finally finds you, you are ready to let it." I was. I am. If this story stayed with you, share where you're listening from. And if you've been the invisible one in your family, tell me. I want to know. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. You've been carrying this alone long enough.